Hi, everybody. So before I dive into designing the fungal city, I'm going to talk just a little bit about my background, who I am, where I'm from, and how I got to here. So first and foremost, I'm originally from an hour outside of Montreal, so from this little French-Canadian village called L'Orignal, which means the moose. It's very apropos. The moose in French. And I studied metalsmithing and jewelry as my first degree. I'm a designer, I'm an artist, and I'm also an educator. So I also taught at NYU for a little bit. So here I am doing some metalsmithing. So I was really interested in materials and overall sculpture and interested in approaching design from that material tactile perspective. So I decided I would do a degree in metalsmithing and jewelry. From there, I went on to design at, or went on to do a master's at the Royal College of Art in London, where I decided to do a degree in critical design. I then quickly got into guerrilla gardening. Guerrilla gardening, for those of you who are not aware, it's the illicit cultivation of someone else's land. So essentially, you see a patch of land. Patch of land is pretty brown. You go kind of the middle of the night, although right now it's not quite as illegal as it used to be. And you go and you plant flowers, or you do some kind of green activation to beautify a particular space. And so I was especially interested in how this was an illegal practice. So I got interested in James Bond, and I got interested in essentially looking at covert tools and how could you design covert tools for urban dwellers. So covert gardening tools. So the first tool here is a briefcase, and it actually has a hand auger, and you drill a hole. And then afterwards, this handbag has its little button on it, and it's got a conveyor belt, and it drops a plant into the hole you just made. And you can see other guerrilla gardeners have been here before. These are actually all sunflowers. And for those of you that are not aware, sunflowers are a really big statement. They're a big statement of resilience, especially in urban spaces, and they leach the soil of toxins. Another piece that I designed was this camera, and although it looks like a camera, it actually shoots seeds 20 to 30 meters distance. So say there's like a hard to reach place on the other side of a train track, you're able to get to those hard to reach places using this camera. And then finally, I was interested in really incorporating this and making this easy for people to, on their way to work and on their way to school, plant as they walked along. So this has a mechanism that every time you walk, it drops a seed behind you. So you can actually walk in circles and see the patterns that you make after things bloom. So after a little while of doing this type of guerrilla gardening, I was interested in aesthetics, I was interested in beauty, but I also got really interested in food. And I thought the most interesting place for me would be to go to Mumbai and start working with people that are actually gardening to sustain themselves for food. And I met with this incredible man named Julius Rego. And he was creating gardens for disability centers, for orphanages, as well as for children's hospitals. So I spent some time there really trying to understand and really trying to help with use my skills in some kind of way, and so collaborate with these people to be able to learn from them, but also be able to offer whatever skills that I had. So we did a lot of different types of gardening. We set up a lot of different types of organic vegetable gardens. Here you can see there's also a lot of interesting ways that people are actually designing spaces. As you can tell, you have like here, this is organic matter in trenches, and the whole area was sloped. So it would essentially filter the water as it went down naturally. And then I thought, I'm going to move to New York City. So I landed here, and I started a small nonprofit called the Subversive Gardener, which is the name of this master's project that I first started. And I started working in various organizations. So here's Southside United, this Las Suras, and they have a food pantry in Brooklyn. So with the nonprofit, we were helping design as well as propagate and working with the community to create gardens. Also working with different schools. And when working with schools, we were building gardens for different schools in Brooklyn, and everything had to be raised because the soil in New York is so toxic. So the more I got interested in gardening in urban spaces, the more I realized it was practically impossible to grow fresh food in the soil. You had to raise the soil. You had to create these structures because it really is all about the soil. And if you really want to remediate what's above ground, you have to remediate the soil. So COVID hit, and like everybody, I was trapped in an apartment and doing a lot of reading at the time. And I came across this article in the New York Times called The Social Life of Forests. I don't know if anyone else saw this particular article, and it really inspired me. So I started thinking, well, okay, so you've got plants in spaces, in urban spaces. How on earth do they communicate? Like, look at the infrastructure. How is it possible for these trees, for these plants to communicate? Well, it's pretty much impossible. So how does soil facilitate plant communication, and does it happen in cities? Well, it kind of happens in parks, right? So you'll have like communities of trees and plants in parks. But if you look at street trees are completely isolated from one another. So on a whim, I decided to apply and do a doctorate, left my teaching job, and started the project, which is now called Designing the Fungal City, exploring mycorrhizal networks in the built environment. And I've been working on this for approximately 2 years now. So to give you a bit of an overview, so cities have been built and have incorporated nature primarily as an aesthetic to landscape rather than for environmental reasons. But recently, cities have begun to turn to street trees and city parks for their ecological benefits and role in building resilience in the face of climate change. So although we hope that our relationship with nature will evolve to become mutually beneficial rather than exploitative, this still remains to be seen. So this research focuses on how mycorrhizal fungi, and it's fungi I found out, not fungi. Fungi is a key element in the health and functioning of urban ecosystems. So what's mycorrhizal fungi? So mycorrhizal associations exist within the microbiome, and this in turn benefits plants by enhancing their ability to mediate interactions with other soil microbes, access and transfer nutrients, and send phytochemicals. So mycorrhizal fungi has a mutualistic relationship with plants. So they essentially hold on to one set of roots from one plant, hold on to the other set of roots from the other plant, and then transmit nutrients back and forth. And this is what you call the mutualistic relationship. So I'll show you a little video here to explain.
Trees may look like solitary individuals, but the ground beneath our feet tells a different story. Trees are secretly talking, trading, and waging war on one another. They do this using a network of fungi that grow around and inside their roots. The fungi provide the trees with nutrients, and in return they receive sugars. But scientists have found this connection runs far deeper than first thought. By plugging into the fungal network, trees can share resources with each other. The system has been nicknamed the Wood Wide Web. It's thought that older trees, fondly known as mother trees, use this fungal network to supply shaded seedlings with sugars, giving them a better chance of survival. Those trees that are sick or dying may dump their resources into the network, which might then be used by healthier neighbours. Plants also use fungi to send messages to one another. If they're attacked, they can release chemical signals through their roots, which can warn their neighbours to raise their defences. But like our internet, the Wood Wide Web has its dark side too. Some orchids hack the system to steal resources from nearby trees. And other species, like the black walnut, spread toxic chemicals through the network to sabotage their rivals. Arboreal cybercrime aside, scientists are still debating why plants seem to behave in such an altruistic way. The hidden network creates a thriving community between individuals. When you're next in woodland, you might like to think of trees as part of a big superorganism, chatting and swapping information and food under your feet.
Great, so thank you, BBC. Lovely. So there's quite a few different types of mycorrhizae. There's endomycorrhizae or arbuscular, so I'll be using both terms. There's ectomycorrhizae. There's both endo and ecto. Some trees have both, so it's almost like various blood types that can actually be universal donors in some capacity. There's orchid mycorrhizae and there's ericoid mycorrhizae. Now, for the sake of this project, I'm focusing on primarily, well, I'm not focusing on orchids. So I'm focusing primarily on arbuscular, which is mycorrhizae that associates to trees like maple, and ectomycorrhizae, which is mycorrhizae that associates to trees such as oak. Both endo and ecto, for example, willows have both endo and ecto, so they can form a bridge, meaning to say that they can actually communicate with both types of trees. So to give you just a quick little briefing here, endo and ecto being the exterior, so the fungi colonizes the exterior of the root, whereas endo, the fungi colonize the interior of the root. So they actually go in and they form these arbuscules in the vesicle. So plants with mycorrhizae explore up to 50 times more soil volume than plants without mycorrhizae. This is why one of the reasons why they're so important. And hyphae can grow up to 10 centimeters from roots, in contrast to the root length, which is an average of 0.2 centimeters. And this is the woman that basically discovered everything. In her seminal article in Nature in 1997, Suzanne Simard, based out of British Columbia, she wrote about a study that they conducted that looked at compatibility of ectomycorrhizal fungi and interspecies carbon transfer in 2 different species of trees. So she was able to prove that there was interspecies collaboration and communication happening between species. Now, one of her students, who is now one of her colleagues, came up with this really important study. So essentially, this is a 30-meter by 30-meter plot. Every one of these are a different Douglas fir tree. So there are 47 trees, and the ones here that have the largest amount of connections are the mother trees. So this one particular mother tree is connected to over 47 other trees. And this is all Douglas firs, so I'm not talking about any other species. And it's important to recognize that this is an oversimplified example of the forest. Normally, forests have at least 4 species of trees and over 60 to 80 species of mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so this man was essentially able to prove that there was such a thing as connectivity, in the sense where he was able to start understanding that there was a mother tree, and that mother tree was able to communicate and send transfer signals to various other trees. Now, with restoration efforts being conducted above ground in urban environments to enable green space to flourish and thrive, realize we've been overlooking the critical underground actors that contribute to the well-being of our urban ecosystem. We humans have evicted soil-based fungi from our urban environment. So if you think about trying to green above ground spaces, it's practically impossible to do so unless you actually start working with the underground actors. And what we've done in cities is we've eliminated nature completely from the underground, and we've replaced it with conduits. We've replaced it with technology, replaced it with human presence. So what are the benefits of creating connectivity in urban spaces? So we believe that there's several benefits of designing mycorrhizal connectivity in the infrastructure fabric of a city. So meaning to say that when you're going to go dig up a street, when you're going to expand a city, then may as well have that conversation about incorporating some type of mycorrhizal connectivity within that infrastructural design. So carbon sequestration, phytoremediation, healthier trees, healthier soil, increased human physical and mental health, increase of biodiversity, and financial savings. Because essentially, having mycorrhizae and having healthy soil means you have healthy plants and you have healthy trees. So I'm going to be looking at what trees and the benefits of trees, and slightly touch on that a little bit as well. So how can we reintegrate mycorrhizal fungi into urban soil? I don't know if anyone is familiar with Anit Singh here, but she's definitely one of the authors that I've been looking to quite a lot, who focuses on the Anthropocene. And here she talks about landscapes enacting more than human rhythms, and to follow these rhythms, we need new histories and descriptions crossing the sciences and the humanities. And this really spoke to me, because I believe it's really about transdisciplinary interventions. I think that all disciplines need to come together to be able to make these types of changes possible. So this is a Venn diagram that essentially looks at my research. The larger here, we have ecological systems, we have environmental design, and then we have a smaller circle here, which is anthropological connections, which is quite important because we do play a role. And then there's environmental humanities. So under the envelope of the environmental humanities, we're able to analyze all of these particular topics. So I've been working on a literature review, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been looking at that's informing each of these topics. So how does urbanization affect mycorrhizae? So this is a study on the mycorrhizal status and colonization of 26 tree species growing in urban and rural environments. And this is a comparison between arbuscular mycorrhizal colonization of trees growing in urban and in rural. And you can see the ones with the asterisk shows you the difference between the urban and the rural, meaning to say there's a very big difference between the health of the soil and health of the mycorrhizae in urban versus in rural spaces. And this was the same thing with the ectomycorrhizal colonization as well of trees growing in urban and rural environments. And then you can see here, this is the comparison between the arbuscular and the ectomycorrhizal. So this is one of the, because there's not that many studies, strangely enough, within ecology that look at mycorrhizae in urban spaces. And this is one of the, I guess, important studies. One of the no one has really kind of gone past this stage of really trying to look at the difference between the two types of mycorrhizae in urban and rural spaces. So how does urbanization affect city trees? So city trees play a fundamental role in supporting healthy urban communities, and they also have a significant social impact by improving the health of humans, decreasing crime, augmenting city community interaction, and increasing property value. I'm sure we're all aware of this. Now, in 2007, Mayor Bloomberg introduced a project which entailed planting 1 million trees by 2017 across the city's 5 boroughs. Now, the catch is how many of these trees are actually going to survive, right? Because it's interesting to plant these trees, but if you don't plant the trees with any type of major maintenance endeavors that kind of go along with it, then a lot of the trees will pass away and die. So how many of these trees will ultimately survive? Dr. Laura Roman has found that out of 100 street trees, only 50 will live to 13 to 25 years old. So I'm sure a lot of us have seen this. This is kind of everywhere, unfortunately. And it's often blamed on the tree, right? It's like, oh God, the tree is really messing up the infrastructure, rather than, oh, well, why don't we design the infrastructure to accommodate the tree? And then again, here's just different elements. So heat reflection from different anthropogenic factors that the trees are needing to deal with. So too much sun, not enough sun, harsh pruning, air pollutants. Of course, mycorrhizae can only help with certain things. But looking at poor drainage, looking at limited soil volume, increased pollutants and toxic waste, it's important to understand the benefits as well as what mycorrhizae is actually able to do with regards to trees in urban spaces. Now, what design principles should we follow? McCark writes a manifesto-like piece, and he writes about the qualities of nature and how designers should lead with an environmentally focused process in order to build a healthier relationship between the built environment and nature. So Ian McCark is one of the first landscape architects to start looking at ecology as a method and applying ecology to design. So understanding that if there's a particular environmental process that's occurring, you need to use and actually understand that process and apply that to your design practice. Biomimicry. Nature as a model, nature as a measure, and nature as a mentor. Another huge influence in my work is biomimicry, because essentially it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about understanding how these connections are happening in rural spaces. And then from there, implementing these particular types of processes in urban spaces. And then finally, looking at Richard Foreman, who works with mosaics. And of course, if you start thinking about street trees, you think if you start connecting these street trees, you would create some kind of a mosaic. There's a lot of design right now that's looking at connectivity between different species, different land pieces that land, and essentially understanding the key flows and movements among landscapes permits us to search for an optimum spatial arrangement in region. So how can mycorrhizal connectivity change the narrative and environment for humans and non-humans? So this, we're kind of going to the smaller bubble here, the anthropology bubble. And I came across this really incredible author recently, Care the Species, Races of Corn, the Science of Plant Biodiversity. So Harden conducts an ethnography of the species by studying how humans care for them. The larger topic of his book is domestication. And he basically says, you know, the problem with the ideological analysis of trees, most evident with topics such as invasive species or the preservations of natives, is that it stridently disregards the life form in question, the plant themselves as mere screens on which the racial projections are expressed. So there's this huge conversation and debate. And of course, this is incredibly important when you're looking at species of trees and its compatibility with species of mycorrhizae, is understanding the types of trees and species that you're looking at. Now, the conversation between biodiversity, native versus non-native. So today, many of the street trees of New York City are lined with trees based on colonial aesthetics, inspired by European cities such as Berlin and London. And you'll notice that a large amount of the trees in New York City are actually not native to North America. And this is because street trees essentially were, when people started incorporating street trees into the design of cities, they were wanting to really replicate European ideals. So they weren't using native trees, and they were also not planting everywhere. They were planting particularly in affluent areas in New York City and abroad. So street tree planting was then introduced, like I said, in the 1800s, when a group of wealthy philanthropic women began promoting the health and aesthetics of benefits of trees. So in some ways, it's great that they were doing this, but in other ways, they were promoting these benefits and planting trees only in specific areas, which then leads us to the street density map. So this street density map essentially shows us where there are plants or where there are trees and where there are not trees. And there's quite a few trees in New York City, absolutely. But then there's also quite a few areas that don't have that many trees, which then leads to the tree equity score. So New York City as a whole has a 93 equity score, which is quite high. So it's a metric that helps cities assess how well they're delivering equitable tree canopy cover to all residents. The score combines measures of tree canopy cover need and priority for trees in urban neighborhoods. But when you really start digging into it, you realize there's actually some areas here that have 67. So it's almost like the areas that have the most trees, the more affluent areas, are actually elevating the tree equity score. Because if you start looking at specific areas in New York City, the score is not 93. So what is our relationship to fungi and the Anthropocene? Donna Haraway, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Donna Haraway. Staying with the trouble. So one thing that I find really fascinating with Donna Haraway is she's now speaking about designing for the post-Anthropocene. So how do you design for the next era, the next epoch? And then again, Anna saying, if we are interested in livability, impermanence, and emergence, we should be watching the action of landscape assemblage. Telling the story of a landscape requires getting to know the inhabitants of the landscape, human and not human. So again, it's about these interspecies relationships. And finally, Michael Pollan. Does anyone know this book? Yeah. So did I choose to plant these potatoes? Did the potato make me do it? So I really just wondered, did the fungi make me do it? Are we making the fungi do it? Who's really in control here? Without fungi, is there really a planet? But without humans, I'm pretty sure the planet can survive, right? So who's making who do what? And can you speak on behalf of non-humans without anthropomorphizing? So I've been doing a lot of, as I said, research and interviews, and I was fortunate enough to ask Michael this question.
I think it's very difficult. I think that's our tendency. I mean, and we tend to respect the creatures that seem the most like us. And fungi seem even less like us than plants, although we're much closer to them on the evolutionary tree than plants. But the things we care about are the things we can identify with. And we can identify things that, for example, move around. It's a big thing we like. I mean, people can look at bacteria under a microscope and feel that they're more sentient than a plant because they're operating on a time scale not unlike ours. They're mobile and not sessile like a plant. So I think what I'm suggesting is it's very natural and very hard to avoid to recognize life when it looks like our life. And I don't know if you can entirely get away from that. I think that it takes a huge effort of the imagination to conceive of the mushroom as an actor, an agent in its own story, because it feels so different than us. But it's fairly easy for us to do that with animals and even single-celled creatures, more than multicellular creatures like plants. And I think that's really curious, and it's a failure of our imagination.
So with that in mind, and with all these bits and bobs of research, now what? Well, this is the fun part. This is where I get to do some research, and some more field work. And so I'm going to walk you through some experiments that I've been working on right now. So I've been doing some model making. I've been working with conduits and really trying to understand how mycorrhizae moves through these particular channels that I've been creating. So I've been recreating various scenarios within like perspect models and trying to understand if you have roads, if you have different channels, if you put mycorrhizae here, will it make its way down here? If you put mycorrhizae, and there's different models, if you put mycorrhizae on one side, will it make its way to the next side? How will it travel? How can we actually design these conduits? So these represent trees here. This represents a road. And so it was a successful experiment. You can see that the mycorrhizae has colonized these roots here. So it's kind of the little fuzzy stuff around. So the mycorrhizae did make its way from one side of the model to the other. So the next step in this particular iteration would be to start actually simulating this in particular scenarios in and around New York. So actually not actually going to these places particularly, but sampling these places. So actually going and getting samples, bringing them back to the lab, and then understanding this, sequencing these samples, and then understanding how the mycorrhizae interacts with these particular root systems. Mycorrhizae identification. So in order to do that, I've had to do a lot of lab work. So it's been about going into the field, so whether it be Central Park, which I've yet to do, but I will be doing shortly, or different types of field, different types of research areas to extract mycorrhizae, bring it back to the lab, and start actually working with it to understand it, to identify it, to start looking at it under a microscope, to be able to propagate it and start understanding how to create inoculums. And here you can see these here are the little hyphae that are surrounding the root. And these are the vesicles, and these are the hyphae as well. Okay, and then third, and I find really quite interesting, third experiment, I've been looking at the data that the New York City street map has, and there's over 645,000 street trees that have been mapped, which is fantastic. But none of these street trees have been associated to mycorrhizal species. So I've gone through each of the 645,399 trees and associated each one of them to a particular mycorrhizal species. Still have not published that information, but that will be published hopefully next year, that I'll be able to share more. That said, it does say that there's 396,712 arbuscular trees that are compatible with arbuscular fungi, which means that if you say there were no sidewalks, you could potentially connect 396,000 trees, which is kind of crazy to think that we've actually created infrastructure in a way that has prevented this particular type of connectivity. Trees are also compatible with exomycorrhizal fungi, so that's oak, like I was saying, as well as other types. And there's 33,975 trees. And this is a speculative map of connected street trees. So this is essentially the hope, is to be able to start connecting these street trees, creating these conduits, and then from there mapping them. Because the goal of this research is to focus on soil-based fungi associated with plants as a key element in the health and functioning of urban ecosystems. And how can we reintegrate mycorrhizal fungi into urban soil through design? And the design of a framework that can be applied to any urban context is the main outcome. So stay tuned. Hopefully I'll be able to present again and show you a bit more work the next coming year or two. And thank you very much.